I didn't make any slides. You've all got a book which is full of pictures of mine. I guess I'm much more optimistic than the younger generation, but it's lovely to see the younger generation volunteering to give up their childcare subsidies and all those sorts of things. Newspapers have been full of attacks on people who have got superannuation and how they should give up their super perks. I think it's really nice of you to volunteer to give up your childcare perks, Justin. Thank you very much. Okay. I'm really going to try just to talk about two things. I'd like you to take away two ideas at the end of the talk. The first thing is that Australia will be able to fund all of the investment that we're going to undertake. And the second thing is that just where we invest is going to depend really importantly on how the superannuation sector evolves. So just two questions. A, we can fund ourselves, but the second one is we're going to fund a lot of it through super, and where the money finishes up will depend a lot on the decisions made within the superannuation sector. So investment is really crucial to the development of the economy, and it's funded in lots of different ways. Most investment is actually funded internally. Firms fund from retained earnings, households fund from their savings, all those sorts of things for their income. And for Australia, offshore has been really important. For virtually all of our history, we've borrowed between 2 and 4% of GDP. And foreigners have been always willing to invest in Australia. A lot of it has been because we've had a lot of land, a lot of resources, a lot of opportunities, growing population. We've also had really good legal system, really good structures for foreign investors. They know they can invest in Australia and get their money out again. So that's going to continue. So even though the mining boom is slowing, the propensity of foreigners to continue to put money into the Australian economy will continue. We went through a near-death experience during the financial crisis. It was a really difficult period. If you have a look at some of my slides, you'll see that it was a very unusual period in that we had the household sector becoming a net borrower. Now, you think about how the economy works in general. Basically, the government tends to run in balance. The business sector borrows to invest in things, and the household sector saves to invest through the business sector. So the real way in which the economy is driven is the household sector saving and investing through businesses. What happened in the middle part of the 2000s was the household sector became a net borrower as well. So we went through a period in which the household sector was borrowing dramatically and the business sector was borrowing. That meant we had to have foreigners invest an awful lot in Australia. An awful lot of foreign savings had to flow in because we had both the households and the businesses borrowing at the same time. That's now reversed. The household sector has gone from investing a lot to actually becoming a net saving sector again. So we're moving back to a more natural sort of structure to the economy where a lot of the investment which is going on in the economy is being funded by household savings. And that's a much safer and healthier way for us to invest, to fund our investment for the economy. During the crisis, though, when both the household sector and the business sector were borrowing massively at the same time, we became very dependent on access to foreign markets. And a lot of the money which came in was actually being channeled through the banks. So the banks would go to New York, borrow lots of money, bring it back and lend it to Australians. What that meant is we became very dependent upon access to those global wholesale markets. The Commonwealth Bank, I think, in the year before the crisis, we borrowed $50 billion from the wholesale markets globally to on-lend to Australians. A couple of years before, it had only been about $25 billion. So we basically doubled the amount of our reliance, in fact, on the international funding markets to actually fund Australia's growth. What that meant is that when the panic happened during the crisis and everybody really worried about whether those wholesale markets would close, there was a real issue for how we would fund Australia's growth. If the foreigners stopped lending, the banks would have to stop lending and there'd be a big crash in the domestic economy. And we all panicked, and we were just talking about it before. Justin was in the Reserve Bank at the time and I was in the Commonwealth Bank at the time, and we were both very focused on the same issue. How do we actually make sure that we don't run into those problems? So the government guarantee turned out to be really important at that stage. Ireland initially started by guaranteeing the loans, the borrowing by its banks, and so then virtually every economy in the world said, we actually have to do the same thing or else everyone's going to give their money to Ireland or those places which provide a government guarantee. So the government guarantee was really crucial during the crisis for funding Australia. We'd become very dependent upon those financial markets. The government's ability to provide a guarantee which people trust depends very heavily on its ability to repay debt. And what we're seeing now playing out in lots of other places around the world is that governments which are highly indebted find it much harder to guarantee the borrowings of their economies. And so one of the reasons why we really do have to think about the long-term public debt position in Australia is that in an extreme crisis, the government is the insurer of last resort. The government insures the economy, and the government has to be able to borrow to be able to ensure what happens in the economy. So it was a really important lesson for us that we do have to think hard about public debt, and countries which don't have that flexibility are in much more trouble. The good things that have happened, though, is there's been a lot of adjustment to make us less dependent on offshore borrowing. Households, as I said, have returned from being borrowers to being savers. So we're actually funding a lot more of our investment internally. The second thing is the banks are no longer as dependent upon wholesale borrowing as they were. I mean, an extreme case that I tell my students is the night that Lehman's collapsed, it had to borrow overnight $238 billion to stay in business, or it couldn't open the next day. And when people said they couldn't access that through the wholesale market, the company collapsed. So that dependence on wholesale markets can be very fragile. And so what all of the Australian banks have done, under pressure from their directors, under pressure from regulators, under pressure from analysts, has been to borrow much longer. So people don't borrow nearly as much very short term, so not overnight. They borrow for 3 months or 6 months or 5 years or 10 years. So the banking system's borrowing is a lot safer. So there have been two really important adjustments which have actually made our borrowing safer and make us much more comfortable that we'll be able to fund our future. The very interesting thing in the future, though, is what's going to happen as China opens its capital markets. The big unknown. We all know that in manufacturing, the whole of the manufacturing industry globally changed when the Chinese started to manufacture lots of goods and export them globally. Well, the Chinese have got an awful lot of savings locked up in China, and they have said that over the next 4 or 5 years, they're actually going to try and liberalise that. What that means is there's going to be an awful lot of Chinese money coming looking for places to invest. So we're going to find lots more Australian companies actually being bought by Chinese. That's the particular one. Maybe it'll happen eventually to India or somewhere else, but at the moment, Chinese one is the place where we do expect big changes to how money flows globally as they liberalise. But the lessons really for us are pretty straightforward. Can we fund our future? The answer is clearly yes. Yeah? Households are savings, and we've got good access to foreign markets. In an extreme case, the government has got a low enough level of debt to actually be able to guarantee our borrowing. So we used to worry about whether Australia could fund its future, and the answer is clearly yes. Yeah, there isn't a problem there. So I've got a much more happy story than you have, Justin. So the second part of my story is around, well, okay, we can fund it in total, but how does it get to the right places? How do we actually make sure that funding goes to where it's most productive? Well, again, I want to split the problem up into two, and let's think about mature firms, mature businesses, and mature infrastructure. If you've got a mature business, guaranteed cash flows, regular business, everybody can model and see what you're doing, then people will always be willing to lend to you. So for mature businesses, mature infrastructure, there will always be either equity investors or bond markets or banks. Someone will always lend to you if they can actually see that you've got an ongoing business and are going to be able to repay. So the issue for Australia as to thinking about where money gets to is we don't need to worry about the capital market and how it allocates money across different investment opportunities for mature businesses, because there's a standard markets and they're all working very well to make sure that happens. The two sorts of things we have to worry about, though, what about the businesses which find a lot more trouble getting access to money because they're new? The two things you can think about are actually new small businesses and new pieces of infrastructure. Well, the underlying problem as an investor is that there's an awful lot of risk. You actually can't look at their books and figure out the nature of their business and whether they're going to be able to fund you on an ongoing basis or not. And so how do you deal with that? I mean, how do you as an individual investor think about should you invest in your son or your daughter's new business that they want to start up? Speaking from personal experience here. And there's a huge amount of risk, and to some extent, a lot of initially, in the early phases, people do tend to borrow from their family. They do tend to borrow unsecured on their credit cards. And if they've got enough assets, they actually use their house or something to help fund it. but they're actually all fairly fragile mechanisms. And the sector which is probably weakest in Australia is actually that mechanisms to actually fund relatively new businesses. As a bank, you actually find it hard to fund a new business, as I said, because you haven't got the security. Yeah, they don't have the assets to pledge. You can't guarantee that you're going to get the money back. So banks actually aren't very good at it. What has emerged in many other countries, obviously, are venture capital monies, peer-to-peer lending, all those sorts of institutions. And in Australia, it seems likely that they will become areas of very rapid growth. And particularly in Australia, the superannuation funds are really important in this phase. As I said, banks find it quite hard to invest in new things, but superannuation funds have got much more flexibility. They actually invest a lot more in alternative assets than do banks. And so alternatives include all these sorts of things which are riskier and include some things like new businesses. And so you can sort of see the model emerging that as the super funds grow, they will be potentially able to fund a lot more of these things. Even though they can't allocate a very large part of their portfolios are growing like hell. I don't know if you realise that at the moment the superannuation system has assets of about, $1.8 trillion, something like that. The assets of the banking system are about twice that, about $3.5 trillion. But because we're all putting 10% of our money into our super funds, they're growing a hell of a lot faster than the banks. And so most of the forecasts are that within 15 years, the amount of money being allocated by the super funds is going to be about the same as the banks. So when you're thinking about how we fund things in Australia, you have to really think hard about how will the super funds evolve? How will they actually start to manage their money to get it to the most productive places? And it really seems to me that that's one of the things that they're going to do is actually find better ways of funding small and new businesses. They can afford to actually allocate a small proportion of their portfolios, a small fraction of their portfolios, to these sorts of things. And we're starting to see some of those sorts of things now. You're starting to see some new fund managers emerge who are specialising in new ventures or specialising in biotech. And they're actually effectively looking around a bunch of new businesses and thinking about which ones are likely to be profitable, and hence which ones can I take a partial ownership of and then on-sell to a superannuation fund. So these are sort of intermediate institutions which are emerging to actually help channel money between the superannuation funds which have it and the end users who actually need it. So we're starting to see more and more of that emerging. And I think that as the amount of money being managed by the super funds grows, then that is likely to be a really strongly emerging part of the financial system. We're not there yet, but you can sort of see the process getting there. Greenfield infrastructure is also really hard. I wouldn't like to be the poor buggers who forecast the traffic flows on the Cross Sydney Tunnel or the road in Brisbane to the airport. I mean, really, really hard to forecast traffic flows. I mean, who the hell knows how many cars would have gone on the East-West link? I mean, some poor economist had to sit down and try and build a model to explain that, and it's just really, really hard. You look around the world and people just have made massive mistakes in forecasting traffic demand in those sorts of pieces of infrastructure. So from an investor's point of view, that just makes infrastructure of that sort, what we call greenfield infrastructure, very, very risky. And so how do you fund it? Who takes the risks? Well, if you're a private investor, you actually want to have a very, very high rate of return, don't you, to compensate you for the risk. You also probably want to find some way of pooling the risk across a number of different people so that you're not taking all of the risk. And the third thing is that some other group, like the government, can take some of the risk for you. And one of the big debates obviously going on around infrastructure at the moment is exactly around that issue. How do you actually allocate risk across the different parties involved, and can the private parties absorb all of the risk? Again, I think growth is going to be part of the story. As the super funds get to allocate bigger and bigger shares of Australia's savings, then they'll have the capacity individually to take more risk in these sorts of areas. They're also evolving new mechanisms. So now a number of the local super funds have actually invested in a particular institution which bundles it up and helps share the risk. I mean, banks do this all the time. Rather than making a big loan to a Quintex or somebody, they actually will get 20 banks together to actually syndicate the loan and share the risk. Well, we're starting to see that now in the superannuation sector. Intermediaries emerging to actually help share the risk and manage these sorts of pieces of infrastructure. these greenfield risks. And so that's a very positive thing, which we can see how the financial system is going to evolve to help solve this problem. The issue of how much risk the government should take is a very, very difficult one. There are some risks which private firms and private investors can't manage. I mean, if you're building a toll road, the potential competitor for you is the bloody government-owned road which runs parallel to your piece of infrastructure. And so you can't actually, if you're going to build a new toll road, you can't guarantee that the government's not going to open up a new road that runs parallel to it and takes all your revenue away. So if you actually, who is the best person to manage that risk is then the question. In that case, really the government is the one who is responsible for the risk and probably is the best manager of the risk. There are other sorts of risks which, I think in the original East-West agreement there was some discussion of industrial relations risk. Who should bear that? There are a number of other things which the original contract specified in terms of how the allocation of risk. The Sydney Road was actually built on a different sort of risk allocation principle. The government actually took it all in-house and actually built the road with the intention of selling it off once it was a mature asset. So in that case, the government still bore the risk, but the government bore all of the risk. And so does the government bear all of the risk and then sell mature assets, or does the government sell part of them? So we're still in the process as a country of trying to solve that problem, to try to figure out how to allocate risk in these new pieces of infrastructure. So basically the problems areas that you want to worry about how the financial system is going to evolve focus on how do we fund new things? How do we fund new private businesses? How do we fund new pieces of infrastructure? They are all very, very risky, and we have to decide who bears the risk. And in some cases, if the private investors want to bear the risk, then you're going to face the after-the-fact problem that, oh, heck, private people built that desalination plant and they're making 40% return. That's not fair. We should try and get some of that back. But they've actually got to take the risk in order to make the investment, and sometimes they'll win and sometimes they'll lose. It's not clear we've got a mature enough political set of attitudes at the moment to actually let private investors take that risk. So again, there's always a risk that the government will come in and try to claw back some of the benefits you get if you've taken the risk. So it's a significant problem for you. So basically then, I want to summarise where I'm up to. Am I allowed to summarise yet, Michael? Excellent, mate. Okay. The capital markets work well, yeah? They do allocate savings, and we are generating enough savings to actually fund our investment. That's quite important, and as investment comes off, maybe we'll even need less foreign investment. But over time, it really seems that the process of generating savings and providing them in bulk to whoever needs them is working quite well. The capital markets work well, the equity markets work well, all those sorts of things. The role of government as the ultimate insurer of all of the financial system is really important. And so the arguments we're having about the level of public debt in Australia are actually really important because that is the ultimate insurer. I think Glenn Stevens said the other day, in a crisis, the public debt will rise very, very sharply. You're at risk of significant problems. So be very careful about that. Chinese liberalisation is the other big unknown, just how the opening up of the Chinese financial system was going to impact on Australia. Probably ANZ worries about this as much as anybody, is going to be really important for Australia. The next thing that really is going to be fundamental is how the superannuation funds evolve. They do have the capacity to become really important institutions to fund new businesses and new investments, new greenfield infrastructure, and they're in the process of generating the mechanisms to do that. But they actually haven't been analysts of credit and all those sorts of core skills that banks hold. But gradually, over time, I think that we're going to see the superannuation funds become very, very important conduits for funds into those places which find it most difficult to get it. Thank you very much.